Hey everyone, it's Austin, and I've got a Jason,
Hello.
and Alex,
Hello.
and a Kalen.
What's good?
And we are back to basics, a Magic the Gathering podcast based around the Commander format. And up today for our best card you're not playing is Jason. So Jason, why don't you tell us about a card that we should be playing more of?
The card I picked for today was Void Shatter. We actually, I think, talked about it very briefly in the previous episode, but it's played in like less than 1% of decks according to EDHREC, or just at 1. And it's a 3-mana counterspell, 2 blue and a colorless. It is obviously an instant. It's an uncommon with Devoid, which means the card has no color identity. And it reads, counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it in its owner's graveyard. This is a great counter spell for 3 mana. Fantastic budget option with your going with counter spells. Gets around things like Pyroblast or Red Elemental Blast because it is devoid, and it exiles instead of just putting it into the graveyard, which is just great. This is a very monetarily cheap card. It's a 3-mana counterspell, and it's one of the better ones for 3. And I think it's super great and very much underplayed. I rarely see it in pods, and I don't know why. It's very good.
I think one of the things that's really, really good about this card is that it's devoid. And I think Kalen can mention this too, because he plays this for basically like the reason to play this over Dissipate. Dissipate's the same spell, right? It's one blue and counters a spell and then exiles it, but it's also blue. So Kalen, you can go ahead and touch on that because I know you've had this.
Oh yeah, this as Jason said, this card is like really great, especially against decks that are like combo decks that are red that don't have blue, because they like to run red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast to deal with counterspells trying to disrupt their combo. The fact that this is technically a colorless spell, even though you can only play it in blue commander decks, really is relevant to, just especially in like CEDH pods and stuff. Sorry, CDH pods and stuff. If there's a lot of like Pyroblasts and Red Elemental Blasts being thrown around. Also, just the exile effect, very good. Like if someone plays a lot of regrowth effects, which, as someone that plays a lot of regrowth effects, getting your combo piece exiled with Void Shatter feels pretty backbreaking. So, yeah, I really like this one. It's only 3 mana for a really powerful effect. So yeah, I really like this one. It's amazing counterspell. 10 out of 10.
Yeah. I mean, they're better, obviously, cost-effective ones, but this is one that is underplayed, I feel, for the 3-mana slot. If you're going for a budget build, or even if you want an Eldrazi build, because it exiles it, which allows you to use some of those pull from exile effects with Eldrazi for extra effects as well. So it's just it's all around great spell. It can go in a lot of different things. And if you're looking for a budget option, maybe a slightly less competitive option, or you're just trying to fill out that counterspell list, this is a really, really good one to take.
I mean, this is, I think a lot of it, and we're kind of at that point in Magic now where, like, especially with all the counterspells they printed over the past, I don't know, maybe 5 or so years, where there's so many different counterspells, and a lot of them are really, really powerful to the point where these 3-mana counterspells, you're likely just not going to play them, right? You usually kind of go over them because you start off with things like Mana Drain, Counterspell. Dovin's Veto is usually better than this. Even Negate is stronger than stuff like this. You always usually start in like Fierce Guardianship and stuff. You play the cheaper counterspells, but I think if you're getting to that point where your deck is going to play 3-mana counterspells, this is like the first one I think you should really look at, or like maybe the second under.
I'd say disallow. Maybe.
Disallow is maybe the first one, but
Disallow's played a lot. That's why I didn't mention it as the card you're not playing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think disallow's the first one, and then this one is honestly my second choice for a 3-mana counterspell. It's really
absolutely.
Great.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
As usual, I have some statistics on Void Shatter on EDHREC. 2,812 out of the 244,293 decks it is eligible to be played in. It is played in only 2,812 of them, which is 1%.
Yeah.
So very, very low played card in comparison to, like, 2,812 decks is no small number, but compared to almost 250,000 available decks, that is quite a lot.
like I said, great in budget builds specifically because it's also monetarily cheap. If you can't afford a mana drain, or I mean, just for money, it's a very expensive card even with a reprint, or something like that. Like this is a really good option. So yeah.
It's
Also,
25 cents.
if you're in something like Baral, like obviously
Yeah.
Baral is a deck that's going to sit on a lot of counter spells. You usually get to the point where you're sitting at a couple of threes, and this one's completely fine because with Baral out, it's just a counter spell that happens to exile. So
And can't be
This is
Hydro
great,
Blast.
and Baral and probably
Yeah.
Talrand are the two decks I would immediately.
oh yeah,
just
and
throw it in.
Talrand too. Yeah,
Talrand,
yeah,
really great.
absolutely.
Because those are two decks that are notorious for a large amount of counter spells, and so this is definitely slots into any of those very easily.
Yeah,
It's in a whole third of Brawl decks, so yeah, it's very popular in those decks, but anything else it's not played very much.
yeah, that seems about right. Just it's a solid card in that deck, and Brawl is just a solid commander if you're looking for mono blue counter.
If you're
everything
really
you
wanting to
can.
annoy the crap out of people, yeah, definitely play Brawl.
Yeah,
If you wanna
that'll
lose
do
the
it.
play-
Well, that's actually a good segue because today we're going to be talking about counterspells, and not just like what counterspells you should be playing, but also just kind of how to play around them. I know that people who have been playing Magic for a long time, especially like myself, I can say from my own perspective, but also just anyone who plays any sort of competitive Magic probably understands this a little bit more. But anyone who plays very casual Magic has the mentality that always gets like shown here, which is the blue is too powerful. They always counter my spells. Blue is too good because they only play counter spells, blah, blah, blah. And it's just this like this mentality that blue is the most overpowered color because it has counter spells isn't correct. Now, blue is the most powerful color in Magic because they keep printing good blue cards. That doesn't
Right.
mean that counterspells are the reason. Like, if you look on average, take each color and take all the good cards in that color, not counting like multicolored stuff or whatever, but just take like all the good white cards, percentage-wise, based on all the white cards they've ever printed. That percentage is higher than it is for blue. It's just that you think blue is more powerful because you only know the really good ones, right?
Right.
But the really good ones are very
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah,
Yeah, like the
exactly.
really
With,
good blue cards are very strong.
Yeah.
Going with that is like, in colors like white and red, the stronger cards appear a lot stronger because they have a much lower floor. The blue has a very high floor compared to the
Yeah.
other colors.
Exactly.
I agree.
There
And
are a lot of good ones that just aren't played because like they're just not good enough.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
it's
That's
ridiculous.
that's definitely a thing, and especially in more recent years. Like I know that if I had gone through, like I went through and sorted out my collection about a year ago now, and I was going through like all the cards that I had, and I only kept the ones that I thought were like playable in Commander or in Modern or whatever. And my blue section went from about like 6,000 cards down to about 100 cards. Like it dropped just drastically. It's just because there's so many garbage blue cards. And I feel like that's just an important kind of thing to note when we talk about counterspells, because obviously a lot of people think like when they think blue, they're like, oh, card draw and counterspells. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but they print a lot of garbage blue cards that are just like flyers, like a 2/4 with flying that can only block flyers for 6 mana. Oh, look,
There
it's
are
a
a lot
blue
of-
card. Like
Well,
all
like,
the time.
if you look at one
All
of
the
the
Zephyr Spirit.
Yeah,
in
it's
Valheim, one of the
garbage.
cards that got revealed recently, it's a 6 mana 5/6 with flash, but it enters
What
tapped.
is your problem?
Oh my, that's awful. Like,
Yeah, that's not great. I mean, the most powerful card in Magic is blue, and it's Stormcrow. All hail.
okay,
All hail our Overlord.
I'm not gonna
Yeah, that's pretty
kick him
strong.
from the call, but I'm close. I mean, I think a lot of people would argue, obviously, that artifacts are more powerful than blue cards. That's just the nature
I will
of.
argue that all day.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Blue
the nature of
artifact.
that is just the fact that artifacts can be played in any color, like
Yep.
you know, and they've actually gotten to a point where artifacts are so powerful, and even now we're printing more and more like colorless commanders and stuff, where like you can play a commander deck that is entirely colorless, and you have basics now, which I'd rant
Oh,
about
thank
myself,
God
but
for
I'm not going
that.
to do that.
The old Karn decks used to play a lot of really bad lands.
I know, okay? I had Karn before they like had wastes or whatever, and man, do you go deep. Like you play if wastes hadn't existed, you would still play Ash Barrens despite the fact that it does nothing for you.
It does
Like
nothing
the
for
fact that it's just basically a
that's
basic in
pretty
that
deep.
deck, and that's all that
Yeah.
you need to worry about, right?
Jesus.
Like right now, I'm rebuilding Coast Select the Great Distortion, and the deck only has like 3 basics or 4 basics in it because it just
Yeah, there's
it
a lot
doesn't
of
need a
colorless
bunch.
lands, especially
So,
recently.
Yeah, more recently we've gotten a lot of just like really solid utility ones because a lot of them are just like a wastes plus, right? Like
Field of the Dead.
well, Field of the Dead excluded, but things like trying to think, Detection Tower. Like I would rather play Detection Tower over
Yeah.
Wastes, right?
Blast Zone.
And Blast
Right.
Zone and all that stuff. Anyway,
Blast Zone's
we're not
good.
talking about colorless stuff.
Oh.
A lot of
Yeah, I
people would
guess you're
argue
right.
that artifacts are more powerful, but if you exclude artifact cards, blue always happens to be next, right? And that's
Right.
even if you look at like the Power 9, 3 of the 9 cards are blue, and the other cards are all artifacts.
Artifacts.
So, although we can sit here and talk about Time Twister not deserving a spot there, that's not the point.
You leave my Time Twister alone.
It should be in the
Maybe you should sleeve it, and then I wouldn't have such a problem.
They are both sleeved.
They're
Thank you
sleeved.
very
Ow.
much.
Yeah.
But-
No,
so-
it was just his underground sea that wasn't sleeved.
Oh yeah, of course.
Oh my
And his
God.
candelabra.
I'm sorry, guys.
You're
I'm sorry.
fine.
No, you're not. Okay,
So
so
with counters,
counterspells.
yeah, counterspells.
Yeah.
Enough picking
to-
on Jason time.
How to play around them.
Well, I kind of want to talk first about like hard versus soft counters and when you want to run them, right? Because
Right.
that's
Yeah, I'm with you
something
on that, definitely.
I see a lot. And for those of you who might not know the definition, hard counters say like counter target spell, and soft counters like unless you pay like X or it has another requirement or something like that. Spell Pierce would be a soft counter target non-creature spell unless you pay 2 mana, something like that. And I, for one, unless I'm playing CEDH or some really fast competitive thing, I tend to go for hard counters in Commander. Personally, unless, like I said, I'm playing at a really high level, specifically because I like to be able to answer a lot of problems, and there's a lot of really good hard counters out there. And like that's what I like to do, like Force Will, Counterspell, Arcane Denial, the list goes on. But I like hard
Shatter.
counters when I'm not playing in a super fast format personally. And if I'm playing a soft counter, it's something like Is It Charm or Supreme Will, in which it has another option besides Counterspell.
It has a second mode, yeah. Like so,
Right,
I
so
think
that way I
Supreme
can use it.
Will is actually nuts. And
I love that card.
Another one too that I want to point out because like it's definitely more recent, so maybe not a lot of people know about it. But like, wow, this card's nuts. Is Whirlwind Denial?
Yep.
It's
Yes.
two and a blue. Counter targets or counter all spells and abilities on the stack unless their owner pays 4. Like
Yeah.
Right.
4 mana is a lot for a soft counter. Like Modern uses mana leak quite a bit, and like that's only 3 extra. Like 4 mana is a lot, and
Right.
also being able to counter things like all spells on the stack from like a storm thing, countering everyone's like counter wars and just like outright winning the counter war.
Yeah.
Or even just things like abilities, right? If someone has a Blood Artist in play and a Wrath goes off, right? And all their creatures die, and then there's like a ton of Blood Artist triggers on the stack that are all targeting you. You could just Whirlwind Denial them, get rid of them. Like that's nuts. And countering Planeswalker abilities
basically-
also really strong. So
It's basically a Flusterstorm, but like with extra steps. It's
Yeah.
it's a really good version of Flusterstorm that allows you to hit the activated abilities too, and it's a really
yeah, obviously
good card.
2 and a blue is different than 1 blue, but it's
Right.
it's got its own merits pretty well.
Oh yeah,
So
but that's why I know like hard counters tend to be they can be more expensive. Like look at like I said, Spell Pierce over even Counterspell. It's 1 mana difference, and when I'm not playing CDH and I'm not playing something where I expect people to play a ton of things early on, really fast. I tend to shy away from them, but like when we're playing CDH, of course, I'm running Spell Pierce, Dispel, Force of Will, everything else like that,
Mhm.
because you have to. That's what you have to keep up with that format. But when I'm playing with even at like slightly lower levels, I tend to focus on hard counters first, and I see a lot of people do this where they're playing Mana League, but they're playing in a really slow pod and they're not super competitive, and then they're like, "Man, this never works out." I'm like, "Yeah, because you're playing against 2 or 3 ramp decks. You're all playing
Yeah.
really slow decks, and 3 mana. You can get people with it, but at the same time, like, why aren't you just running Counterspell? Like,
Yeah.
that's not a very expensive card, or like, why aren't you running like a harder counter in this slot if that's what you're going to be playing? And so
Mhm.
that's my big point with that, is that I think if you're not going to play that super high competitive level, I really think you should stick with the hard counters first, or like I said, something modal.
And even like so, there's like a subset of counter spells where they're X cost counter spells, which I've always thought are like really nice, because if you have a bunch of mana late game and someone just dumps all their mana into some X spell like a Genesis Wave for 26, you can just be like, syncopate that for 2.
Oh
Oh,
yeah,
you don't
no.
have 2 mana left? Oh well, that sucks for you. It's gone. No.
Syncopate is
Don't get
one
me
that
wrong,
I think is
soft
Yeah.
counters.
really, really powerful because it also exiles, like we were talking
Yeah.
about with like Dissipate and Void Shatter. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I
a
don't
really
know, probably
powerful.
my favorite subsection of counterspells, and it's a subsection I look a lot towards when I'm in a much slower environment, like you're talking about earlier, Jason, is the 5 mana counterspell, then do something. Like
Yeah.
Confirm
Yeah.
Suspicions or Desertion are probably my 2
Desertion.
favorites.
or even just
Yep.
like Mystic. Oh no.
Commandeer.
Commandeer's a good
Commandeer is
one.
really good. What's the one where it's modal and you can pick the same mode twice?
Mystic Confluence.
Mystic
is
Confluence.
3 choices.
Yeah.
Confluence is what I'm looking for.
I
Yeah.
do like Mystic Confluence a lot, but that's a little different. That's like, you can pick 3 Mystic Confluence, 5 mana, 2 blue, 3 colorless. Choose 3, can choose the same mode more than once. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Return target creature to its owner's hand or draw a card. Like, this is definitely a soft counter that I'd probably consider, because 9 mana is a lot usually.
Yeah, if you
even
need
for like
to
a big
counter a
ramp
spell and be
deck.
like pay 9, like
Yeah.
it's a lot.
Yeah,
usually.
try.
Yeah. Or you can always just like pay 3 and I'm going to draw 2 cards, or bounce the thing that I didn't counter earlier and counter your other thing. Yeah, there's a bunch of different stuff there.
Yep, absolutely.
It's definitely like, I don't know. I think you should find a balance when you're what level you're playing at and everything else, because I've seen people who are playing what I'd call, maybe not kitchen table, but definitely not like CDH, or even like what you call like top tier competitive deck. You're playing a little lower, and they've got like a spell pierce in there, and they're like, "Well, this one game I stopped somebody." I'm like, "You will get somebody sometimes. I'm not saying you won't get somebody sometimes. You always will. You will get someone with a manatize sometimes. Like, the consistency though is, I'd rather have a 2 mana counterspell in this slot, or a 3, like something else. Like, I'd rather have a Swan Song at least, right, instead of a spell pierce. Here they get a 2/2 flyer, and then you get the counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery.
That's
Uh,
another one that I think is a little underplayed. Like it's played a lot
Yeah.
more in CDH, but like
Right,
Swan
because it's a
Song
1 mana.
is so
It's a 1 mana
good.
counterspell.
Yep.
But there's a lot of cheap options for counterspells. When I was looking for cards underplayed, it turns out a lot of them are played a lot, and I'm hoping anyone listening, you guys probably have seen some cool counterspells, and well, if you enjoy counterspells like I do, there's a lot of good options to pick from, monetarily cheap as well as mana cost cheap.
Well, that's the thing, is they've printed so many counter spells now, because like every set you get like 2 to 3 blue counter spells, right? And
Well,
then
you get the blue mechanic counterspell, and then you get like a 5 mana one sometimes.
Yeah, and like it just, like, even if we look at like the Caltime spoilers, you see like we got that counter spell that has foretell, right? Like
Right.
we're always going to get those in every set, and it's going to come down to all the really, really powerful ones are obviously going to be really expensive, but then all the ones that are like tier 2 that are just right below how good the first ones are all going to be super cheap, because there's like 16 of them, right? Like that's just how that works. So
Yep. I agree. Actually, I think my favorite counterspell that I include in basically any deck that I'm running blue, in which I run in counterspell, is Muddle the Mixture. It's a absolutely great card. 2 blue, counter target, instant or sorcery, and it's got transmute for 2 blue and a colorless.
mm-hmm.
And I love this because I can't think of a deck that I own that doesn't have some significant 2 mana thing that I might want to grab. But it's also a counterspell. Like, this is a great modal counterspell, and I love it. If you're running like an Icon Scepter combo, it grabs either pieces of the combo. It grabs a bunch of different like artifacts and key things. It can grab demonic tutors. You can like transmute into like a demonic tutor if you're running black, and then go find the thing you actually need. It can do so much, and I do.
Muddle of the Mixture does grab both halves of the Timefall combo.
Yes, it
Yeah,
does. It
I don't know. I
definitely
like
does.
Muddle more in combo decks than in like a normal deck. Like I don't like it as much in like value decks because there's not as many good 2-drops in those types of decks.
Actually,
In a
you and I
value
both
deck,
know I'm
I'm
gonna say
agree.
Jitte, and that's what you
True.
can grab.
Well,
with Muddle
that's an
Mixture.
aggressive deck. Like it's good in aggro decks. It can find GT. Like
Yeah,
It can,
I've transmuted Muddle Mixture for Jitte way too many times against Alex specifically.
it can find a few important stacks pieces like Torpor Orb and Winter Orb too.
Yep.
Yeah.
It can
Like-
it can grab a lot of really relevant cards, and I don't. It's definitely not underplayed. I think it's in like 6% of decks or 7%. Like
quite a
it's
few
it's in a lot, but it's definitely a very good card, and I absolutely love this card for counter magic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Serves a
I
lot
agree.
of good purposes.
Yeah, and that's just that's just like another point too, is there's like we kind of talked about it already, but just like the number of counter spells that you need to play. If you really want to go deep, you super can. But if you don't, it like I think most of my decks, like Niv obviously is a combo heavy deck, and I think it only plays 3 counter spells.
I think if you're going to run a counter spell, you should run at least about 3 or 4. I don't think there's a
Yeah.
magic
Yeah.
number specifically.
I don't. Well,
but the reason
no,
why
it really depends
I
on what you're trying to do. Like
Right.
I mean, how many counter spells does Kenrith play? Caleb?
Oh god.
Probably like 8.
Maybe 8.
It's
I
like
gotta
7
think
or
for a
8,
second.
right? I'm just trying to think of all of them.
Void Shatter, Dovin's Veto, Counterflux, Sublime Epiphany, Syncopate. It's not many.
Yeah, like
It's
even
really not
my
many.
really heavy control decks like Will and Rowan or Tamio, like they only play. I think Will and Rowan has 11, not counting the copy spells that like can copy counter spells. But like, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a magic number. I think it depends entirely on what you're doing and what your deck is trying to do. Like obviously, Baral is going to lean more heavily on your counter
Right,
spells
counter
and stuff,
magic.
but
Well, it's not that there's a magic number so much as I don't see the point of running one counter spell in your deck. Right, like your
yeah, I
chances
think you
of
probably
drawing
want
it, your
2 or
chances of
3.
getting it,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
the reason why I say when I put counter, if I'm going to put counter magic in a deck, I'm going to probably put 3 or 4. And the reason why is because of the odds of just drawing it, finding it, and it being useful. If you have one counter spell in your deck of any kind, and unless it's like a creature counter spell like Mystic Snake or something like that, but unless like you're running that, I don't see the point of just having like that one random counter spell as your one out. You should have a couple and like use it kind of to help tempo out the game. But yeah, like I said, I don't think there's a magic number so much. I just know personally when I put counter spells in, I'm putting at least 3 or 4, and that's what I do, and I like that. It means I have a good chance of finding them and drawing them and using them when I need them.
Yeah, that's like I think the good number for Niv is I'm pretty sure it's 3. It might be 4, but it's just it's a good number where you might see 1 or 2 a game if the game goes super long, but the chances of you seeing more than 1 is pretty slim, and a lot of the time in a deck where you don't need a lot of counter spells because you'd actually have a rather higher number of the cards that are actually doing something to win the game, then that's like a good number. Yeah, and that's a very important.
So if you look at a lot of like combo decks, you see like usually like 8 to 9 counter spells, but they're all like extremely narrow counter spells because they're trying to protect their combo with them.
Yeah, they're the
They're
really
all
like
like
efficient ones, right? That's
yeah,
your things
well,
like
they're
you're
all
going
like
to see
spell,
like
they're all
Swan
spell
Song,
pierces.
Fierce Guardianship, Spell Pierce,
Yeah.
Maybe
Red
Dispel.
Elemental Blast and Pyroblast if they got red.
That's another thing too. If you're not in blue but you're in red, you probably should be playing one or the other. Like I'm not saying every deck would. Like mono red goblins, probably not. But if you are doing
Depends on what you're trying to
anything and
do.
like just one red elemental blast or pyroblast is really really good.
If you
Until you're at a
also
table with no blue, and then you feel really bad.
Well,
Well, if
it
you're
has
running
it kind of
something-
runs double duty because like okay, the chances of you sitting down at a table with 3 to 4 players or more players or whatever and not seeing blue across the table is pretty slim, honestly.
Really, the only time that's happened for me is when we said, "Yeah, no one's playing blue," and then the one person that was playing blue pulled out a non-blue deck.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's pretty
What-
rare, I think.
Red also has a lot of different ways, like Faithless Looting or Tormenting Force, ways to discard a card and draw cards.
To get
And, like,
value
that's-
out of it, yeah,
Right.
exactly.
That's how they do a lot of card draw. So they're. I'm not saying like you need to run them hand in hand, but a lot of mono red decks specifically will have those like discard to draw effects, and you have a dead card in hand, then you can pitch it then as
Mhm.
well. So I mean, you can even in mono red justify running both if you're running a couple of those effects, because if you're not running blue, you don't think you need, you can just pitch it.
And the other thing too is that it runs double duty because it also just destroys a blue permanent. So something like
Yeah.
a mono blue deck that isn't really running a lot of counter spells because they're more aggressive, then you can point it right at their either one of their planeswalkers that's really powerful or one of their creatures that's doing a lot of work. Like the chances of you seeing blue across the table is pretty high, honestly.
I think so, unless you have a very specific meta, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, right now with the whole pandemic and everything, your metas might be pretty specific, but moving and branching out either online or as this pandemic subsides, and you can go back to your local game store more often. I'm sure your meta will more diversify again, and there's a good chance that you'll be playing blue somewhere. So
I agree, absolutely. And then that kind of brings over to the next side of things. Because we talked about like counterspells that I think you should be playing a bit more, but moving on to playing against blue as a good segue is just knowing how to kind of play around counterspells, because I think a lot of people don't really know how to do it necessarily, or they just don't want to learn. So breaking it down and doing it the simplest way is fairly important. I think like learning to play around not specific counterspell, but just like playing around counterspells in general is a very important thing to touch on. So
yeah, whether it's baiting out the counterspell with another spell, or waiting until you have a mass number of cards that you want to resolve in a turn, so you can go like, counter the first thing. Well, here's the second and third thing.
Yeah, like control players don't always have it, and this is a good
Yep.
important takeaway from not even just commander standpoints, but also just like competitive, like modern or legacy or standard or whatever. You don't always have to play your spell into a counter spell. It like that doesn't work, right? And like if you, let's say for example, your opponent is has all their mana untapped or whatever, they're probably going to anticipate you casting something, and sometimes it's okay to just take a turn off and be like, pass. Like you're not doing anything and I'm not doing anything, so I'm going to build resources until you try and throw the first punch, and then I'm going to throw a second one and it's going to hurt. Like
That's how you
that's
win a lot of counter wars. Actually, something.
I mean, yeah, the control
miss a
v
lot.
control is you don't want to be the beatdown in that matchup. You want to be the control in that matchup.
Something to consider in Commander specifically is that like how many blue decks and if people are running counterspells or not, especially if it's a known meta or if you know someone that might not play counterspells, because there are some people who play blue and they don't run counter magic. But if there's just one blue player at the table, and maybe we can talk a little bit about more of this in a minute, but knowing what to counter is also very important. And
Yeah,
I like to
absolutely.
finish up. I like to finish up on Austin's point before we move to that point, but just a quick look at it is like they can't counter everything. If there's one blue specifically in like the scenario of one blue player, there's one of them and three of you.
Yeah.
Normally, they cannot counter everything you play. And we can, like I said, I'd love to talk a little bit more in a minute about like knowing maybe when and what not to counter, but that's such an important thing too, is that maybe the thing you're playing isn't the thing that they're threatened by, or they don't realize it's the threat or something else, whether it's a combo piece or whether it's just a big big chunky boy that you want to put down on the field. Sometimes they're not going to counter it because they either can remove it a different way, or they're more afraid of something else, or whatever. And sometimes you got to slam it and hope they don't have. Sometimes you have to play as if you're never punished. Um, that's the big takeaway
yeah,
here.
there's like a really big important thing there. Is it's called Cowboy magic, which is just you know what, giddy up, try it, like slam this spell, and sometimes you just got to do it, and you kind of just have to force the action.
I am notorious for Cowboy magic.
And it's not even okay. So excluding the 1v1, the heads up, or the head-to-head formats and stuff, that there's a very important look thing with Commander, like things to look at and consider, that not only can one control deck not really control the table very well, like it's very, very difficult. And you could ask Kalen, like Kalen's done this countless times, playing like the only control deck at the table. Like it is a nightmare sometimes. And like being the police at the table is very difficult. And something
start
that
begging
people like to target you when you're not
Please
really the target.
stop doing this. Like, he's gonna win, and they're like, no, counterspell, bad.
yeah, I mean, threat assessment in and of itself is just a different thing.
Yeah, no, there totally wasn't a game where I was playing Gorkal and Kalen was playing Kenrith, and I had like 38 power on the table, and everyone was attacking Kalen.
Yep.
Yeah, I was upset.
Counterspell bad.
Well,
How dare you?
But I think the important thing is that like seating at the table also matters, right?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
turn order matters so weirdly with counter magic in Commander, because like priority is passed in around the table clockwise, so you can't, like, if I'm player A, like if we're seated just like we are here on the screen, right, and I cast a spell, Kalen's the first one to respond, right? And if he has no responses, then it goes to Alex, then it would go to Jason, and then if nothing happens, then my spell resolves. So the biggest takeaway there is, if I'm a control player, right, I've got a handful of counterspells, and Kalen casts something really stupid. If Kalen is like a big haymaker deck, and I have to stop his stuff because he's got the 5-alarm fires that I'm having to put out, Alex and Jason have it really easy, because that means that I'm spending all my resources stopping the first person, and I can't hold up resources for everybody else. Right? And like that is a very important thing there. Like, seating arrangement matters really, really big for counterspells in Commander specifically. So
I actually encourage sometimes to switch your seating arrangement if you're going to keep playing the same decks, because it can get really obnoxious.
Seating arrangements I mean, especially being, if, like, for example, if we were doing the exact same thing here, Kalen's playing control like he normally does, my seat sucks. Like,
yeah,
because if Alex and Jason pass their turns and do literally nothing, all of my spells, if he's holding up counter spells like ready to go for stuff, like, my stuff is the one that's going to get hit almost 99% of the time, because I'm last in the turn order, and he's not going to, I mean, he could just take a turn off and not do anything, but the chances are pretty low that if I cast something gross, I'm the one stuck getting countered, right? And so, and I completely agree with you that, like, changing seating arrangements when you're not changing your decks around is actually pretty important. Like, seating arrangement matters a lot. And it's not even just, like, who goes first or whatever, who goes, one after another, but just it can really, really matter where the control player is seated and where the aggro deck is seated and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
as someone who's played a lot of aggro, you never want to be directly before the control player.
no,
because it such a feels bad when you like play your thing and then it gets wrapped
immediately
away.
get
and then
wrapped
you're like,
away. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that sucks, obviously, as an aggro player as well, just in general. But, like, the fact that it didn't even last more than a turn, it just, like, died right away. Like, that sucks.
Right, and
so,
I'm sorry, Alex. Sorry, Austin. Continue.
yeah, you're fine. I was done.
Oh, it's like you as the aggro player. If you fill the board, you slam a couple things on, you might actually trigger the reason why they want to board wipe. And so, yeah, rather than if you did that a couple turns, like if you did that, I don't know, on a different point of the turn order, and then someone else did something else, and they're like, actually, I can hold that on this board wipe because I got this or that, or I don't know. It's just like, oh, there's a giant board state, and I have to wait all the way around to get back to me. Yeah, I'm gonna just board wipe right now. And it's
I agree.
and of course, we're talking about like it depends on the scenario too. If you're playing against more than one control deck, things can get a little bad when depending on what you're running and depending on what you're doing too, right? If you got two
They'll
control
like,
players,
yeah, like the table arrangement, like Kalen Jason playing control decks is a nightmare for the two of us. Where like
Yeah.
Alex and I are like, God, we're dead. This sucks. Like it's just so bad to have like one control player completely ready to screw me over and one control player ready to screw him over. And it's just like, oh, this is such a hard nightmare to fight through.
Well,
and like a lot of
Jason never
control
plays the
players,
actual control, so
what?
you don't have to worry about
I
that.
play stacks, the purest form of control.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
No, the pod, like the normal pod that would happen if it was the four of us playing, would be Kalen on control, Austin on like a value combo control deck, and Jason on stacks, and me on aggro.
No,
It's
no.
true.
Yep,
And I would have
that's-
0 chance of winning.
That's about
you
right.
you would have a hard time. You're not wrong. That would be a nightmare for you. Like stacks in general, pretty bad against the aggressive decks, or the aggressive decks have a hard time against because they make the battlefield a nightmare. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
I think kind of back to the topic of playing against control, and the big thing is to not allow yourself to get frustrated to the point that you play bad. Control is supposed to take, they want the game to go long until they get their either combo or big whatever that is their finisher. Different control players use different things. But I know, especially when I play with either younger players or players who play a little bit more casually and they don't. I love playing against control decks. I love it, and whether I win or lose, it's usually really fun for me because it's a whole another aspect of the game I like to do. But I have played against with either, like I said, people who only play very occasionally or a little bit more casual players, and like stupid blue, and they get really frustrated, and then they just start like slamming things every they're like, well, I guess you're going to counter this. I'm like, yeah, you gave him 3 turns to draw. Like, he drew 6 cards. He probably has a counterspell in hand. Maybe take a breath. Do you need to play it this turn, or can it wait a turn or two? And maybe you can either juke him out by like playing something else, or maybe someone else will eat the counterspell or two, and then he'll be tapped out. And there's only a couple spells that are free at that point. Like,
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
when you're playing against control, even if you're playing like a super aggressive strategy, you need to take a second and step back and think, is this like, it comes down to, if this gets countered, is my game kind of over? Or it, like, you need to really take a step back and think and just calm down, because I find the easiest way to lose against control is actually get really frustrated.
Yeah.
You
You're
get
gonna
frustrated,
start-
you get flustered, you start making bad play decisions, and that's what's going to get you to lose against control.
It's gonna get you to
And-
lose. It's
or-
gonna feel bad for everyone else too. Not like blaming the person who gets frustrated, but like it makes it a little weird sometimes. I've played against some people who've really thrown a fit before, because like, stupid blue, and I was like, but I mean, yeah, this is one of the things that blue does do though, is to counter and then board wipe, right?
That's like a, well, that's not even just. Obviously, there are some blue cards that are really, really powerful. Things like Cyclonic Rift, I don't want to get into. Like, that card's ridiculous. But
yeah,
looking at just in general, every color has the thing that it's trying to do. And I understand that blue being counterspells is like super annoying, because it's like, well, I spent 20 mana on my spell, they spent 2 to counter. And it's like, you're right, it sucks. But also, they don't have a way to kill creatures, right? Like, they have such a hard time dealing with creatures. And
they've got very few in mono blue specifically.
in mono blue,
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
like,
you
look
can always branch out to
they
other
have
colors, but-
reality shift, they have pongify, they have rapid hybridization, and then they have like the bounce spells, right?
They
And-
got
well,
the new.
and
They got the
they
new.
now
one.
they have
And now
Raven
the new
Form.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like it, they have a hard time dealing with it, right? Like, I play blue green Merfolk with Kumena, and my removal suite is awful, because like, the only way to really deal with creatures and things that are in the way are those 3 spells. And then I also play the blue green one from guilds that I can't remember the name of. But it's hard to deal with creatures for blue. And so their way of interacting is counterspells. And if you take counterspells away from blue becomes the worst color. Like, and that's it's not their only color identity. It's just that they have a lot of, like, their other color identities are like card draw, and like drawing
That
just
is
drawing
their
cards does
removal,
nothing,
right?
right?
Yeah.
Like it's the way that they remove things. Like white has exile effects, at least it used to. Black has every kill spell under the sun. Red deals a bunch of damage. Green puts creatures into play that are much bigger than their opponent's creatures. Blue
they can
needs
fight
to
too.
counter
Green has
spells.
fight.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
it just comes down to like green's removal is creature based, black's is spells based, red is damage based, blue needs to counter spells. That's what it needs.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
And
complaining about it is causing an imbalance in both the colors and the archetypes of the format.
Yeah.
So
I think
going
some
back a
people-
little bit to what Jason was talking about with the or like what we were talking about, like how playing around the counter spells. Going on kind of the other side of it, if you are the person playing the counter spells, you don't have to counter every single haymaker spell.
you don't.
Like one thing that I do a lot when I play control decks is I sit there and look at the spell that's being cast and think, "Am I dead if this resolves?"
Or
Like,
in
and
a
if-
really bad position.
Yes.
Am I backpedaling?
If the elf ball player is casting Craterhoof Behemoth, yeah, you counter that one, right?
Yeah.
If the elf ball
If-
player is casting a Priest of Titania with 0 elves in play, it's a powerful card. No, you don't need to counter it.
Don't need to counter that
no,
one.
that one can sit
Probably not.
around. Like
It's also based on if you have a board wipe in hand or
Yeah.
you know, whatever else.
obviously the
removal
context
as
of
well.
your hands matters a lot.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
And so, like I said, we can't obviously give you everyone a guide on what exactly to do. It's always situational. It's always based on what's going on with the board, what's in the graveyard, everything else. But it really does. You don't have to counter everything a lot of the times. I'm like, oh yeah, that's perfectly fine. I got a Supreme Verdict in hand. Like, play as many things as you want, as long as it doesn't
Yeah.
kill me, wiping the board. Or if you know someone else is playing a lot of board wipes, in like a Mardu list or something else, like they're running a bunch of board wipes. Maybe you don't need to counter it because they haven't played a board wipe in 3 turns. You know they have 10 in their deck. They should be able to remove it, and you might want to force them to do that, and then you're saving resources as well.
And that's actually another thing that I was going to point out too, and Kalen can attest to this a lot because I usually tend to do this quite a bit and obviously seating arrangement again matters quite a bit for this, but if there are 2 control players at the table, the way to win that game is to make the other control player use their resources, right?
Mhm.
Like
Correct.
That's how you beat control 1-on-1 as well.
Well, yeah, like you force them to be the beatdown, and then you can be the control deck, and your deck's obviously better at being that. But like, again, seating arrangement right here, Jason casts something really, really gross. I look at my hand full of counterspells, and I go, yeah, pass priority. And like, I force Kalen to be like, this is gonna kill us, and he needs to spend his resources. And then that when it comes down to, you know, the 2 people who are not playing control that eventually kill each other and die, and then Kalen and I are sitting there fighting, I have a handful of stuff that I can actually react with, and Kalen's been dead in the water for 20 turns because he countered all your spells, right? Like, you're not just trying to... It's not you versus the world. It doesn't have to be.
Right.
Like, as a
Yeah.
control player, it could be you with one other person against 2 other people, or you with the 2 people against the arch enemy. Like, that just comes down to it sometimes, right? And that's an important thing to look at counter spells too. Like, even if you play a bunch of them, you don't always have to counter things. Let other players do it, because then you can start winning the game. You start eking, turns out, and that's what matters. So
Yep.
And like as the control player, sometimes like if like someone else is going off and the aggressive deck puts a bunch of power into play, don't wrath immediately, because chances are they're probably not going after you. They're going after the deck that they think is going to be closer to winning, because that's how aggro has to function in Commander sometimes.
Yeah.
So don't like immediately wrath the board when they play a giant threat. Let them go after the other person first.
No, your life is a resource, and I want to spend a whole episode talking about that. But it's okay if you get hit for 10. You start at 40. Like, it doesn't feel really good. But if someone just like, yeah, I'm gonna swing at you for 10 this turn, and you're sitting like, well, if I wait one more turn, then I'm gonna be able to do a lot more damage, right, or something like that. Then it's okay to take that 10. Like, you win the game if your life total is at 1 or a million. Most games anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not counting the alternate win conditions. For the most part, your life total at the end of the game, as long as it's above 0 and everyone else is below, you've won. It doesn't matter what it's at.
The only life point difference that matters is 1 and 0.
Yep.
It's the only one. And that's just I mean, obviously as a control, like, and we're not even trying to just tag on like just control players too, because like we're trying to talk about counterspells in general, and obviously control kind of leans itself that way. Because I think we could sit and talk about control as in general here for like an entire actual episode. But
I think we have it on the list at some point.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, I want to do like each of the archetypes, but it's counterspells in general. I think an important takeaway, and we're kind of getting to that point in the episode here. Counterspells in general, you shouldn't complain about them because they're necessary for the world to work. And by the world, I mean all of us nerds playing Magic the Gathering, not actually everyone in the world.
Everyone in
some
the world.
counterspells.
Everyone in the world, yeah. The counterspells that I think you should look more at, things that you are kind of looking over. I think a lot of the good and really powerful counterspells are the ones that are right below all the powerful ones, right? Like, stop looking at every blue deck being like Mana Drain, Counterspell, Force of Will, Force of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, like all those. Start looking at your Whirlwind Denials, your Dovin's Vetoes, your Counterflux. Counterflux is nuts.
Really good.
Even Negate. Negate's just a powerful spell, right?
Yeah. Disallow and Archmage's Charm if you're in mono blue or maybe 2 colors are also
Tails End.
Archmage's Charm.
Yeah,
really
Tails End.
great.
Yes.
Tails End is a card we have not mentioned yet.
Not this episode. We talked about it a lot last episode. But
Yes,
Tails End is
Tails End a lot.
absolutely nuts. That spell is super powerful. And it might
We're gonna
actually
talk
end
about
up
it more.
as a best card you're not playing, honestly. So
It's a good card.
it is.
Yeah, definitely.
I think
that list is a very good list.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. Yeah, and I think I think that's kind of, unless anyone has anything else, I think that might actually wrap up our counterspell episode. We kind of talked about all the different things, and do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, real quick, for those of you who are trying to get into like control, obviously we're going to cover control a little bit more, but with like counterspells, do take into like maybe even if you haven't built the control deck that you want to start thinking about like if I had a counterspell, would I really want to like counter this? But like what are good counterspell targets? A really good thing to practice. I know a lot of people who like I want to play control, but I never seem to win because, and the one person in particular I'm thinking of, but there's other people, like they counter literally everything you play until they're out of cards, and then, which is something of course we talked about, and it's just like really sit back and think like, man, this would be a great time to have a counterspell, and like just start thinking about that in games while you're building your control deck, and start thinking about like, that's a good target, that's not a good target. And I think when you start doing that, you start, one, getting better at threat assessment, and 2, you start understanding from like the control like counterspell player's mind of like, oh god, I'm screwed, or yeah, I've got this.
Exactly.
This game's in the bag.
Absolutely.
So even if you're not playing control, but you're maybe interested in it, and like I said, counterspells and control aren't necessarily hand in hand. You can always play decks that aren't blue that are control, but if you're interested in it, and I know some people, one person in particular who listens to our show, a friend of mine, has been like, well, I really want to get into control, and there's a whole episode, like we said, we talk about, but to them and anyone else who's really interested, start thinking about like, what would be a good time for a counterspell, and not just every single spell, but like, what is the times you really want to counter something over maybe something is allowed to resolve, and I think that alone will make you a better player for, like I said, threat assessment, and just understanding what's going through your control player's mind at the table, because those are really important skills to have.
Yeah, I agree 100% actually, and it's as someone who has played a lot of control now, I will say that control, while you may think as the jerk of the table, they're almost like playing like the support class, where externally you're trying to keep it as calm as you possibly can, and internally you were screaming constantly. But control is some of the funnest play style I've ever played. I love playing control. Kaylin loves playing control. I know Alex enjoys it. Like, yeah, we all enjoy control, and I think personally, if you're looking to step up your game, absolutely start with a control deck. Like, I understand that that's like taking the bar exam with no preparation whatsoever, but you will start to evaluate. Like, once you start winning with the deck, you'll eventually get to a point where you'll start winning because you're starting to make better threat assessment, and it's gonna teach you the hard way. And I think that's a good thing to
You'll
do.
start kicking yourself when you lose.
Yeah,
and
For
probably
stupid reasons.
Yeah, the last point for this is that if you play control, you're going to lose a lot because you didn't have the answer that you needed, because you countered the wrong thing, because either from your own mistake or because they outplayed you. You're going to get outplayed a lot, and it's a good hard lesson. And
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why I love playing control, is because I'm always like, next time I'm going to think about that. Like,
Yeah.
and it's made me a better Magic player. I know it's made me a lot better at just critical thinking in general.
Well,
So
that's
don't get discouraged if you sit down and like, I'm gonna brew this control deck with a bunch of counterspells, and like the first 3 games you just get stomped because you
Right.
don't quite understand what to do or anything else. That's okay. It happens. It happens to everyone who
It's-
plays control,
it's because
especially in the
it's
beginning.
because control teaches you to play a little bit differently. Because if let's say you're the aggro deck, you worrying about your opponent's counterspell doesn't really matter what that counterspell is. You're just like, you could be like, well, I'm playing around X counterspell, and you don't need to play around a specific one, right? You know that their deck has, for example, like we talked about with Kalen's deck, right? He has Dovin's Veto, he has Counterflux, he has Void Shatter, he has Syncopate, he has Supreme Epiphany, or Sublime Epiphany? Sublime Epiphany.
Tails
like,
End.
And Tails End, right?
Gotta throw that one in there.
So now that there are 6 counterspells that I need to worry about. Do I really care what those counterspells do? No. All I care about is the fact that they counter my spells. And the only one that is really specific is Dovin's Veto, because it only counters non-creature spells, right?
And
So-
Tails End.
I guess it Tails End because it only counters legendary spells. So I'm looking at those and I'm being like, well, I'm playing around a counterspell. Kalen, on the other hand, is playing around, let's say, for example, my Niv deck, and he's like, well, I'm playing around this combo piece. Like, I need to stop this one from hitting the table. So control, especially playing counterspells, forces you to think about all of the cards you could be playing against. Whereas playing against counterspells, all you need to know is that their spell will counter your spell. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's all that
You're gonna-
matters.
You're gonna learn a lot more
As a
about.
control
I know
player,
once I
yeah.
started playing control, because I was introduced to Magic as an aggro player, and then I fell in love with control, and I play it in almost everything now. But I know that, like, when I first started playing it, I was like, oh yeah, I really should watch out for that synergy or that combo, and like it opened my eyes to like powerful synergies and combos that like I play, because I thought, oh, that's really cool, but you don't even think about it until well, you lose to it, or
Exactly.
they just outvalue it with it or something like that. It's yeah.
Sweet. Yeah, I think that was a lot for counterspells.
Yeah.
Oh,
But I
yeah.
think that's definitely a good point to kind of end it on. So real quick,
One more thing.
sure.
If you don't want to play control and you're tired of it, consider going on Scryfall and looking up uncounterable spells.
Oh
You might
yeah,
find some good ones.
Play
Put it-
Run and
we could-
Tarnish
we
Pirate
could
in
take
your
run
decks.
into your deck. Yeah, there you go.
If you really don't like counter spells, there are ways to beat it. There are uncounterable spells. There are commanders, specifically Rurik Thar comes to mind, that punishes
Surik.
control players.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Camball.
there's
Camball will do it.
Campbell.
there's
doing it.
quite a few commanders. If you really hate the idea of playing control, and that's perfectly fine, or at least blue-based control with counter spells, there are so many different ways to build your decks to beat around it.
Yeah.
You don't just have to fold to counter Magic. There are so many uncounterable spells and ways to punish the blue player at the table.
I agree.
If you really, really don't like it, and we're not going to cover every single one of them here, we listed a couple, and we might do we might do a whole episode. Let us know in the comments about like ways to beat blue, or well, control in general, I should say, not just blue. But yeah, as he said, if you don't like it, there are ways to beat it, and just sitting there and complaining about it is not the way to beat it.
Exactly. Well, I think that is all the information that we're going to throw out for counterspells. I've tried to
Yep.
end the episode twice now. I'm going to end it this time.
Ah.
Okay. I'm going to make a couple
Wait,
of points.
there's more.
First
Wait,
things
there's more
first.
things.
No, first things first. I would like to remind everyone to like, comment, share, subscribe. If you hate all of our ideas, please like, comment, share, and subscribe before you start commenting on how awful we are. I would really appreciate that. We're also over on Twitter, and you can go ahead and follow us. The link for that and the handle and everything is below in the description. I don't think there's anything else that we really like cover in the description currently. We're working on Instagram. We're working on secondary platforms. We will hopefully get those up at some point in the future. And is there any small points that we want to add on to Counterspells?
No,
Perfect. Awesome. Yep. No,
everything's
that's
another
perfect. Awesome. I love it. We're done. I love it's great. Anyway, my name is Austin, and I'm joined by Jason, Alex, Kaylin, and we are Back to Basics, a Commander podcast. Have a good one, everybody.
See ya.